Hi, I'm Liz Homer. I'm the curator of the Turner Dodge House and Heritage Center located in North Lansing in Old Town. Each first Monday of the month, we sponsor a program featuring one of Lansing's local history gurus. Tonight we'll be talking with Jerry Rowe, who has become interested in the Lewis and Clark expedition and the Corps of Discovery, and I think you'll enjoy this program very much. After the program, we'll give a tour of the house with Ron Turner, and if you were here in person, you could come with us. We hope you will sometime in the future.
It's very nice for all of you to come out on this terrible weather to listen to some kind of a historic story that was based in the paper today without the title. And what I mentioned to Liz, I've done this program a couple times on Michigan governors and things like this. But one of the things that I was inspired to do, and I said I'd be happy to do it, is the story of Lewis and Clark and the Corps of Discovery. And how does it affect Michigan? Well, they certainly were not from Michigan. However, what their exploits were certainly affected this entire country. And being a native Montanan and growing up in Montana, I've done the trip twice, all the way from Clarksville to Fort Clatsop. And it's an awesome thing, and again, I grew up and traveled it a great deal. About 55% of it was in the state of Montana, where because they did the return trip and the flip around, as we call it. But why I chose the subject, and I've been doing a lot about it, is that in coming up here in 24 will be the bicentennial. And as you know, we've already started the celebration of the Lewis and Clark trip by the issuance of the Sacagawea dollar, everybody's seen. And it has this beautiful young maiden on the dollar, and of course there is no known photograph of her in existence. And so they tried to reconstruct it from whatever. But I just wanted to tell you why it's so important in my judgment. When somebody says to me, who are probably the greatest Americans that ever lived, I'm kind of biased a little bit, but I'll start out by saying number one, George Washington. And George Washington, why? Because as the first president of the United States, he set the example of what this country would be. He set the tempo, the direction, everything on what kind of a country we would have in deference from an oligarchy or a totalitarian kind of a government or a king or anything like this. So therefore, I look at him, and then I look at Lewis and Clark because of what they opened. When they did this discovery trip, and they called it the Corps of Discovery, it was awesome, the hardships that these people went through. And it all started way back with the dream that Thomas Jefferson had, that dream, that he wanted to know what was in the West, what did we have in the West, and primarily, is there a direct water route? Now, how many saw the Ken Burns and Stephen Ambrose series that was just on? Okay? It's a very awesome experience, and I've gotten to know Steve Ambrose fairly well, by the way. And his book on Lewis, I always kid with people saying, well, I've got one of the first autographed copies, 100 of them. And so that's really great. But the thing is that Jefferson had this dream, and he tried to get a discovery group going prior to when Lewis and Clark left. And so he talked, and he tried, even before he was president, he had this dream. You know, Jefferson had the greatest library of anybody in the country, and most of his books, the majority of his books were on the West. He was fascinated with the West. And as you know, the Library of Congress, that's how we started out. The Library of Congress was with this collection. So finally, he went to Meriwether Lewis and said, look, I want you to head an exploration group to find out if we can have a direct water route all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And so they started, they took a year in planning. In between, just before they were getting underway, the Louisiana Purchase came. They were very nervous about fighting with the British and the Spanish over the lands going through. In fact, the Spanish had come up through Mexico on 2 occasions on the way out and the way back, trying to intercept that trip because they didn't want it to succeed. And that's one of the things that had happened. But I think the thing is interesting is that Lewis went to Pittsburgh and he studied. He was the medical person on that trip. He studied how to be a doctor. They had no doctors on that trip. And he studied biology, he studied the sciences, he did this kind of thing. And that's where he spent a great deal of time. And he said, if I go, he said to Jefferson, if I go, I want to have a partner in this. and I want my former commander when I was in the military. He said, I want William Clark. William Clark, there was about 4 years difference between the two in their ages in their early 30s. And Clark said, he had made it very clear, and he said, I'd love to go on this trip. And Lewis said, I insist that we both have the ranks of captain. And when Jefferson agreed to it, did the whole thing, but when Jefferson came back, he never did give him that rank of lieutenant. I mean, he was a lieutenant. And Lewis says, it hasn't come through, but as far as we're concerned, we will be captains on this trip, and we will have co-authority. And do not let that be a question at all. And Clark was a little upset about it, and never did get until Clinton gave him that rank and made it permanent as captain. He had never gotten that captain's rank, even though he was a general later on. I mean, they came back, out of some reason they came back and they said, we want you to have that captain's rank, and it just got before Clinton left office. He did several things before he left office. And so anyway, it's fascinating that the friendship that was developed between those two men, the only arguments they had on that entire trip were two. And that is that Clark never could be resolved to eat dogs, which they ate a lot during the way. They would purchase them from the Indian tribes and what have you. And Lewis never liked salt. So those were the two things. And it was amazing how that friendship merged. And remember, they were there 2 years, 3 months, and 10 days that they were living together, and that they did all of these things together. It was awesome. So what they did is that they decided after Lewis had had his training, etc., they purchased the supplies, and they were going to rendezvous at Clarksville. Now, I went down to Clarksville in November. Now, Clarksville's in Indiana. Clarksville, Indiana, was right across the river from Louisville. Louisville was the big center, and that's where the home of his sister and brother-in-law were, and that's where Clarks came to give the report. And I got to tell you guys something about Turner and Dodge in that room. I was in the room where when they returned, it was the dining room, and I stood in that room where Lewis and Clark had debriefed with Clark's older brother that most people don't realize was George Rogers Clark, the hero of the Northwest Territories who captured it without losing one life. And to be in that room, I was with this gentleman, this guy that took me through. I was there in the morning, and I said, I don't want to leave yet. And he said, well, come on in. He opens the gate. We sat down at the table. It's not the original table, of course, but just being in that room where these two gentlemen had come in and given that report, you guys, it's awesome. Because there's very little, you know, other than the things they brought back. So they met at Clarksville, and they put together, they were going to, how many men are they going to take? The thing had to be, to go on this trip, it had to be men, of course, because of the strenuous kind of trip that it was. It was when you hear what the stuff, they didn't talk that much. They mention it on the program on PBS, but you don't realize this when you get into the details of reading of what they went through. And so what they did, they met and they did their first camp. They camped at Camp Wood, which is on the Mississippi, but was on the Illinois side. And they spent kind of the winter there. And they put together about 45 men. 12 of them turned back, 12 or 13 turned back after they went up to Knife River in North Dakota and brought back the first specimens and stuff like this. Then they stayed over for that winter, 1803. And then they went to Camp Du Bois, which is up by St. Charles. And they left St. Charles and up the Mississippi they go. And it's interesting, they lost their first person. Only one person died on this entire trip. Only one. And he is buried in Sioux City. And he was a sergeant, Sergeant Floyd. And they figured he died from peritonitis. You know, the consumption, they didn't know what the terms were back there, what it was. But when I stopped there last January, the monument is about 50 feet tall. I mean, it's this big obelisk where he had died. And not one other person died on that entire trip. As they're going up, they're traveling, and they had troubles. You know, the Mississippi is a wild river, you know, it was wild. And they went up, when they left, they had a keelboat and 2 pirogues, and a couple little canoes that followed. keelboat was about 40 feet long, and they took tons of supplies and materials with them to trade with the Indians. I mean, when you think 4,600 needles was one of the things that they took. Tomahawks, guns, and things that you would, trinkets, you know, all of this, and the Jefferson Peace Medal, which was a medal because they're under the Great White Savior and all of this. As they're going up the river, there were two very, very nasty Indian tribes that didn't want to put up with any of these white folks coming up. One of the Teton Sioux. The Teton Sioux. And that's where Clark, and remember now, Clark was the military man, and he did the mapping, and he did all this stuff. These guys were so good, but they'd get to a point and they'd say, it's 1.25 miles over there. Then they'd take out their little surveyors thing, 1.25 miles. I mean, it was just awesome what they could do. And so anyway, they pass this, they do the bluff with the Teton Sioux. They stare them down, they look them down, and it was close. They had the guns pointed, everything, and it was really the biggest bluff job of all. And Clark was really upset about it. Lewis is sort of sitting there, you know, like standing there like this. And they finally make it up to Knife River. Knife River, that's when they met the Mandan Indians, and they stayed, the Mandans were partners with the Hitatsis. And so about 17 miles below, they built Fort Mandan, named after the Mandan Indians. That's where they built the fort. I was there just a year ago too. I try to go there every year. And it's really awesome, this little fort. And you think of forts, it's like the first time I went to Pennsylvania and saw Fort Friendship. This was Washington's post, where they were, well, that fort wasn't any bigger than this room in here. You know, so they're so small. You know, everybody thinks of forts are these big giant things. You know? And so anyway, make a long story short, we have to get along on time. When they left at Fort Mandan, they met a gentleman by the name of Toussaint Charbonneau. Charbonneau was a French trader. He was half Indian, half French. And he had 2 wives. And one of them was this young 16-year-old girl named Juwitse, Sacagawea. And as I have learned since getting involved with this, Sacagawea. Of course, I'm using the Shoshone pronunciation, because she had been a Shoshone and was been captured by the Hitatsis and was brought back to Fort Mandan. So as they're going along on their trip, they're going about, the thing they talk about all the time are the Great Falls. The Indians talk about the Great Falls, the Great Falls. Well, interestingly enough, it's the Great Falls in Great Falls, Montana. And when I just got back, I just spent 15, 16 days, and the river walk that they have, you walk in the footsteps of Lewis and Clark for part of the way. And you stand at Rainbow Falls where Clark is going like this, looking out over at the site of Rainbow Dam. There are 5 dams right in a row as you go down. But it's an awesome feeling, guys, to be there and to be walking in the same footsteps as Lewis and Clark did. It really is an exciting kind of thing. And they had to portage, and they couldn't go up. Remember, see what made it so tough is the river was wide, and they were going upstream. And so they were pulling it, cabling it, and the trips they were trying to do, pushing those boats and getting everything going, the trip back was so fast because they were coming back, you know, down, you know, with the flow. And so they portaged in Great Falls 18 miles around to go to White Bear Island. At White Bear Island, they spent 1 month to reconnoiter and what have you. White Bear Island is in the south part of Great Falls, and it's where the Missouri and the Sun River, there's a confluence of the Missouri and the Sun. And the thing that I always got a kick out of it is that 18-mile portage, I did it, by the way, and it's a tough one to do. It took me 3 days to go the 18 miles because you've got to get so many permissions. And one of them was at 3.5 miles that you had to walk across Malmstrom Air Force Base. And so when you do it. Now, when they did it, you guys, they were tugging these boats. They tried to come up with the idea when the wind would come up to put a sail on. But they were portaging these boats. The keel boat went back when they were in North Dakota, but they had the pirogues. And the pirogues were made out of logs, and they're very big. And then with the canoes, they were carrying these things across the field. Biggest problem they had, what? Prickly pear cactus. Their feet would be like this at night because they had moccasins. and they even tried to wear double moccasins, the prickly pears. The other big obstacle they had that just about did them in, said very simply, mosquitoes. The other two things that they had a real problem with, there were thousands of rattlesnakes. In Crusette, one of the sergeants, one time he said, "Oh, is that a bird or something?" He reaches into a plant, pulls out a rattlesnake by its head. I mean, they're big rattlesnakes. And the other thing were the grizzly bears. Grizzlies weren't a bit afraid of anyone, and so they had the problem with grizzly bears. So they camped at White Bear Island, and there's nothing there left. It's a housing development out on an island. And then they went down the Missouri through the gates of the mountains of Helena, which I swear is the most beautiful place in America. You can talk about glacier and everything else, but when you go through the gates of the mountains, and you're driving, you can look and see eagles flying, and you can see mountain goats at the top, the ledges walking and stuff like this. It's awesome. So they go through the gates of the mountains. They go to Three Forks, Montana. Three Forks, Montana is mouth of Missouri. What happened there? What happened at the beginning of the Missouri? Okay, it's the Madison, the Jefferson, and the Gallatin. There were no dummies, because remember, they named everything after friends, and everybody on the trip got a name for something. Of course, Jefferson and Madison were big buddies. Jefferson's president. Gallatin is Secretary of the Treasury, so he got his river. And that's when they ran into trouble, because they're getting ready for Travelers Rest. They're at Three Forks, they're going to Missoula, and they're getting ready to cross the Bitterroots. The Bitterroot Mountains, part of the Rocky chain. The Rockies chain is where the fires were. A lot of the fires this year in Montana were around that particular area. And they had to negotiate to get horses. Well, they run into the Shoshones, and they run into a chief that didn't trust them very much or anything else by the name of Camelweight. And Camelweight, and this is the most astounding trip in the point of the entire trip. And so Camelweight is there and said no, they're very reluctant if they wanted horses to go over the mountains, etc. And while they're there negotiating, Sacagawea shows up. Now the reason, one of her great advantages, she wasn't so much the great pathfinder, she helped in that part of the country, because remember, she's just a young kid when she had been captured and left. And so what she did is that whenever they saw a woman with a baby, the Indians looked at that as a peaceful situation, that it was not a war party or something like this. This is the great part of the whole thing, is when they're talking and all this, and Sacagawea comes up and she looks up and she says, "Brother." Camelweight, the chief, was her brother. Now this wouldn't happen in 1 million years, to happen like this. Well, right then, "Oh, sister," and they, do what they do. And so anyway, they got the horses. Well, this is where there were several times. I mean, what these men would do to exhaustion, the food supply was very erratic. They'd go for 3 and 4 days at a tremendous pace and not have a thing to eat. I mean, because remember I said that, the guys that started out on this had to be men, but they had to be hunters, they had to be, carpenters, they had to be able to do something in this. So 2 or 3 of them were the hunters. And they'd go out and they'd get buffalo or they'd get this, but man, there's some of these places that they got nothing. And so they got the horses and they started going over the Bitterroots. When they were coming up, they missed a little cut through that would have saved them a month. Hundreds of miles. And they missed it. It's 160 miles over the Bitterroots. Up and down, up and down. It's awesome, awesome. And that's where they almost chipped it in. There was no food. And they were going, that's where they would meet some of the Indians down the road. They'd eat dogs and stuff, but they would kill their horses. They'd have to eat their horses. And it was a very frustrating trip for both of them. So then they cross over, they meet the Nez Perce. The Nez Perce were very, very friendly, and the chief they met was interesting, because that chief lived quite some time. And it was Chief Joseph that ended up at the Bear Paws in Montana, where he was captured. So anyway, they get over, they cross the mountains, they're exhausted, they meet the Nez Perce, they get on the Snake River, and then they get on the Columbia, and they go to the mouth of the ocean. Now, have any of you ever seen the Columbia River? The Columbia River is the doggonest river I've ever seen. You think the Missouri, you think the Mississippi's wide. Man, when I saw it the first time, the Columbia, it just was like double, any other the river I'd seen. So they went in, and Fort Disappointment was just north in Washington, and they crossed over and they went to Fort Clatsop, named after the Clatsop Indians that they dealt with. And so they spent the winter there, and they got to a point, if you can imagine in today's world, the thing that made them sick and they got tired of it constantly, just tired of it, is salmon. They got so sick and tired of salmon that they ate it and it almost made them sick and all of this and that. That's when they went out and went to the salt pits. That's where the famous story of the whale, where they heard of this big giant fish on the ocean. They went down and watched the Indians, the Clatsops, cutting up the fish and all of the whale and all this. Now, because of time problem, we're going to start going back. They return and the trip's much easier. They've got it pretty much figured when they go back. As they're coming back, they go through the mountains, do the whole thing. They found their ways. It took them a lot less time to come back. They split in Montana, in Great Falls, and that's where the Grizzly chased Lewis into the Missouri River, literally chased him into it. They split up. Lewis goes up north to the Milk, and Clark takes the southern route on the Yellowstone. They're coming down. And what's kind of interesting, guys, that is they split. Now there, no television, nothing, and they were going to rendezvous down by Pompey's Pillar, by Billings, and they missed it by 8 hours. And they're gone like 4 weeks, something like this, like 4 weeks. And they were going to rendezvous, and this is where Lewis meets the real nasty Indians, called the Blackfeet. And the Blackfeet, they were going to be pals, and they're all spending the night and all of this and that. Next morning, they hear this little rustling type thing, and it's the Indians running off with their horses. Well, they weren't going to truck with that. This is the only real danger thing that came in. Lewis shoots, kills one Blackfoot Indian, and Crusette, the other, I think it was Crusette or Drouillard, shot the other, killed 2 Blackfeet. And they said, we're getting out of here. And in the journals, they said, and we rode for 100 miles without stopping. No, they weren't about to stop. And that was the one computation. It was over the horses, the stealing of the horses, etc. But anyway, they rendezvoused when they came back at Pompey's Pillar. Pompey's Pillar is interesting. That was also this last episode named a national monument. Pompey's Pillar is a sandstone monument, mountain, about 230 feet tall. And on that little mountain is the only living, the only physical existence that there was a Lewis and Clark trip. And I've seen this several times, and up at the top of the mountain they chiseled in W.J. Clark, July 26th, 1806. And that's chiseled in there, and that's awesome to see. And as you're up on this boulder, you can see all around the area. Right across the Yellowstone River is where Custer had camped when they were out years before. Custer went over, in one of his books, he says the greatest thing I've ever seen was that Lewis and Clark. He put his initials on the boulder somewhere, and nobody found it. And somebody said to me, because I'm kind of a Custer fan, he said to me, well, Custer's luck. It was probably on the wind side. But to walk up and to be on these places where you know they were, and then they came back and they stopped at Knife River, and as they're coming down from Knife River, that's where they left Sacagawea. It was interesting. They didn't respect Toussaint Charbonneau at all. Lewis was so-so in Sacagawea. Clark really liked her. They had a thing, you know, it was just a relationship that he respected her, and it was interesting. And if you go to Montana and you go to all these areas and you see all these things, there are more things, well, there are more things named after Sacagawea than any other woman in the history of America. There are more things. And even one of the big places in Great Falls where Charlie Russell, the great artist, used to ranch and stuff like this, it's called the Judith Gap, and there's the Judith River, and that's named after Judith Hancock, the 14-year-old girl he fell in love with and all this, and when he got back, when she turned 18, he married her. But you'll find all of these tie-ins with all these names and the various things like this. As they're coming back, they go through the Teton Sioux, they're all lined up, and Clark says, bite, and he yelled at them, you're rude and you're nasty and we're not stopping. Because the tradition was, for the Tetons going up, is that all of the fur traders and stuff like this would lose half their cargo in payment to get through. But boy, he stood right there with their uniforms, they're looking him right in the eye. And they said, we're not going to do anything. And he just said like this to them. They go down, and Cruz Hat's shooting, and he thinks he sees an animal, and he shoots Lewis right in the rear.
Oh.
So for the last 5-6 days, Lewis is in pain laying down on this little canoe boat. He was in one of the canoes, not the Crows, and they had him in a canoe, so in he comes. And so in September, they arrived, they meet some of the trappers, and the thing that was so important, a big thing was whiskey. I mean, they ran out of whiskey their first year out on July 4th, their celebration. And that was the big thing, God, and so the trappers came in, and they would trade information for whiskey on what was it like going up there. Probably one of the most awesome trips in American history. When they arrived, they became all national heroes. And what I think, by the way, as I look back and reflect on it when they came in, the aftermath is probably the greatest story of all, what happened to all these people. And Clark and Lewis both were, all of the men that came back received double salaries and 360 acres of land. And the two captains got 1,600 acres of land. And Clark became head of the Indian agency for the Louisiana portion of the state, Louisiana area. And Lewis was governor. And Lewis committed suicide on the Mississippi Trace. And about 3 years afterwards, and Clark lived to the ripe old age of about 79. Lewis had some real difficulties in his life, some problems, very high strung, very emotional person, and suffered a great deal from depression. And but on the trip, it was just amazing. Everything seemed to blow up when they got back. Probably one of the most unique things. Most of the men. One of the sergeants lived to be 93. Another one, 3 of them, by the way, interestingly enough, 3 of them were killed by the Blackfeet when they went back up. And the most famous one who left on the return from Knife River, the most famous guy that's in a story in itself, is John Coulter. And Coulter was the gentleman who was captured by an Indian tribe, our friends from up at northern Montana, and the Blackfeet. And he ran naked 3 days for several hundred miles and beat them on the run. And his claim to fame is that most people associate him with is he was considered the discoverer of Yellowstone Park. And they referred to him in that park when he described it. No one believed him. Mud puddles, pots, and geysers, water shooting up and stuff. And they referred to it as Coulter's Hell. And he was one of the people on that trip. But interestingly enough, he was not one of the stars on the trip. On the trip, it was the Field brothers and some of those guys that really did things. It was, if you can imagine the physical strength that it took. It was just amazing, just physically what these gentlemen would go through. They would drop. They wouldn't eat for 2 or 3 days. And they had such a feeling, and the dealing, they met over 21 different Indian tribes, and they negotiated and what have you. And the maps that they came back with. And interestingly enough, you know where all of their records are? Where would you think the records would be? They're at the Philadelphia Philosophical Society building. They were sponsored, and that's where they all ended up, was in Philadelphia. And they had brought back these tremendous specimens. They brought back flowers, and they brought back roots and animals. They brought back some live animals that caught at the end. And they brought back dead rattlesnakes, and the buffalo is so awesome for people to appreciate and what have you. But I really got into the Lewis and Clark thing just because of the tremendous story behind opening up the West. And I think probably not only that I'm a Westerner, but I think the thing that is so amazing is what they accomplished themselves. And lugging it, they have an interpretive center in Great Falls that is probably one of the finest in the country, and